Having a positive outlook is great, right? It's important. If you want to achieve things in life, then a positive outlook is certainly going to be better than being a mopey pessimist. And the same for gratitude. It's important to be grateful for what we have. I've always been a strong advocate for gratitude and gratitude practices, but I have discovered a wrinkle. And today I want to share that with you. And this is a bit difficult to talk about. But if you're interested in improving yourself, and if you've been going through a difficult period, if you feel like you kind of have to dig yourself out of a hole, and maybe you kind of feel like you've been carrying around a load, then I think this message will be helpful for you. This video is about grief and about guilt and about how these things connect to the positive attitude and the gratitude. So let's talk about grief. That's a heavy word, isn't it? We usually use this word in the context of death, of losing a loved one. And we realize that when we lose a loved one, this is saddening, but it is a part of life. And we have to go through the grieving process, which is accepting the loss, accepting the new situation we are in, and going through the emotional process needed. And this is kind of probably the most acceptable kind of grief is you lose a loved one and people understand that you have some grieving to do. But the same thing applies. Grief can also happen for much smaller things, for much less dramatic or tragic kinds of loss. And with smaller kinds of loss, it can be difficult to acknowledge what's going on and allow ourselves the needed process of grieving. Here's how this played out for me and how I came across this in my own life. So about 2 years ago, as I'm recording this now, was the beginning of a string of just unfortunate kind of bad luck incidents in my life. And I'd already been going through some difficulties when the big one hit, which was the COVID pandemic. And for me, the lockdowns coincided with basically when I had planned to start the Icario project. Now, I'd already spent many months planning this, and I'd spent before that many years developing this idea of what I wanted to do. And I had put everything in place and gotten everything ready, and it was an almost perfect convergence of just about when we were supposed to start was when the world started locking down. For me, this was difficult on the one hand because this whole project, what we wanted to do is I wanted to do an apprenticeship with a group of people on in one place for several months. I wanted to do in-person workshops and live events and all kinds of things that I had planned out, which were all now suddenly impossible to do. And that was difficult. And even in my personal life, I was strongly affected by this. I had just started to invest more in my social life, to spend more time with people, to socialize more. And I wanted to do more of that. I wanted to also take up martial arts training again, which, group classes, that was off the table as well. And there are many other things like that I had, I'd set things in motion. I'd also moved to a place and settled down for the first time in a long time. And because of the pandemic, basically all of the reasons why I moved there essentially disappeared. So I was in this situation where on the one hand, lots and lots of things that I've been working on for a long time and many plans that I was just about to start, I kind of saw that all crumble away into dust in my very hands. And that was sad. And in addition to this, I decided to not simply cancel the Icario project because the guys on the Icario team had already, signed up for this, had already we'd already done a lot together, and everyone had kind of arranged their lives to make it possible to start working with me. And I didn't just kind of want to pull the rug from underneath everyone and just be like, okay, too bad, guys. So I decided to try and go ahead anyway. So in addition to everything else, I was also suddenly faced with a much bigger challenge than I had expected. So it was immediately, how do you create a plan B? How do you make this thing work anyway? This is where the positive attitude comes in. From the very first day, my attitude was to rise to the challenge, to simply accept, okay, shit happens. Things are clearly not going how we planned, but let's simply rise to this challenge. Let's do what we can to let this challenge make us stronger instead of just rolling over and giving up. So I immediately had a positive attitude. And like I said in the beginning, that's important. There's nothing wrong with this. But here's the problem. If you think about COVID, it happened to everyone, essentially. And think about all the stories and all the tragedy. How many people have lost loved ones? How many people have suffered, have experienced suffering and death? And we have all kinds of stories of, people losing their livelihood, people losing their jobs, overworked healthcare workers, all kinds of things. For so many people, the pandemic cut really deep. And then there's me. And I have a little project that didn't work out, and I have to work harder over here, whatever. It's like overall, I'm still extremely privileged. My life is still going great. Financially, I'm doing great. It's lots of stuff. Of course, my social life suffered and my mental health suffered and so on. But whose didn't in this time? And compared to most people, am I not massively privileged? And so who am I to be complaining about this? This is also what makes it difficult for me to even make this video. I really don't want to come across as someone who's like in a privileged position. Most things are basically going great, but here I am whining about, I didn't get to do exactly what I wanted to do and that I have some mental health issues or whatever. Just like, join the queue, right? If you had some depression or whatever during this time, being locked inside and whatnot. Who am I to be here whining about these problems? And this, I think, is like a 1-2 punch that is really destructive. On the one hand, it's like, hey, have a positive attitude and be grateful for what you have. And on the other hand, it's like, shut up about anything that goes wrong for you. As long as you're not, think about all the other people suffering more than you, so don't complain. And why is this a problem? This is a problem because it gets in the way of the grieving process. See, it's true that I'm in a luckier situation than most people, and the losses I experienced in the last 2 years are less tragic than many people's losses. That is absolutely true. But subjectively, to some degree, it doesn't matter. I did suffer loss. I did suffer difficulties. And without acknowledging that, the grieving process can't take place. And as a result of that, I'm essentially carrying like a heavy load of emotions around with me. What I realized is that this is something I have to do. I have to be able to simply accept that this happened. And I have to be able to accept that, yes, this was saddening for me and it is painful for me. And regardless of how lucky I am in other aspects of life, like that the pain is still real. And I have to be able to accept that. And I have to allow myself to grieve whatever loss that I have experienced. Whether it's not a competition, right? It's not like who lost more, who suffers more. That doesn't matter. You have to process it anyway. And I'm making this video because I wanted to share this because I'm sure that there's lots of people who have experienced something similar, who feel like whatever loss I've experienced is not as big as these other people's losses. And so I have no right to complain. And so I have to keep my head up and pretend like everything is fine, or something like that. And I think that ultimately that's just not helpful. With that said, how exactly do we go about this? How do we process our sadness and let the grieving happen? Well, if you've seen my content, you probably won't be surprised to hear that my first suggestion is writing. If you give yourself time to sit down and write about the things that you lost, the things that and how it makes you feel, the sadness that you feel, and accept it. And you can be very literal about that. You can say, I accept that I am sad about these things. And I accept that I feel guilty because I'm comparing myself to others and so on. You should be very literal about that. And let yourself process these thoughts and these feelings through writing. Writing, I think, is the best tool to do this in a very deliberate manner. So if you can resonate with what I've explained here, and if you maybe also feel guilty about even admitting that your smaller losses are actually saddening to you, then that's what I recommend you do. And here's a final important idea. We generally don't like dichotomies. We like to have clear answers of it's either or. And we don't like when kind of two things are true at the same time. It's more difficult for the mind to grasp. But very often that's true. And that's what I'm talking about here as well. You can be grateful for what you have and grieve for what you've lost. It's not one or the other. It's not either you're a victim and everything is terrible and you get to complain and be sad, or you're not a victim and everything's great and you don't get to complain at all. It's just not like that. So there are many things in my life that I'm hugely grateful for, and I continue to be grateful for them. And I continue to do gratitude writing every day. But I can at the same time feel sad about other things in my life and give that space to express itself as well. So that, I think, is the healthy way to look at it. This is a dichotomy, and both of these things can and are true in anyone's life at any given moment. So that's one of the lessons I've learned recently, and this is all part of me being public about how I'm rebuilding myself. I'll link to the video where I explain how that came about below in case you haven't seen that yet. And also, of course, this is not as exciting as some other Icario content that you might have seen. And for sure, more action-packed content is coming as well. Don't worry about that. And if you're wondering why this is the kind of content I also make, then you can check out the podcast episode where we talk about why I've turned into such a softie. And, isn't it all just about being a badass and crushing your enemies and driving them before you and all that kind of stuff. So more on that. If you're kind of a performance focused, I want to go after it, then that podcast episode I think you will enjoy. So with that said, I hope you found this useful. If you did, and if you resonate with the story I told you, let me know in a comment below. It really helps to get feedback from people and really helps to hear from your experiences as well. With that, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. I recently spent 10 days road tripping through Norway and staying in cabins far away from civilization out in wild nature so that I could do nothing. And it was really good for me.